On August 17, 2017, the Justice Department committed to end Operation Choke Point. The House Judiciary Committee even wrote them a letter expressing their displeasure with the operation. By August 18th, we were seeing articles of Trump ordering the end of Operation Choke Point. Of course, these articles have plenty of condemnation for ending the program, as it was, quote, incredibly effective at cracking down on the flow of money to fraudulent merchants, end quote. Nevertheless, we even passed a law to end the possibility of Operation Choke Point in the future. This bill specifically says that, quote, an appropriate federal banking agency may not formally or informally request or order a depository institution to terminate a specific customer account or group of customer accounts, or otherwise restrict or discourage a depository institution from entering into or maintaining a banking relationship with a customer or group of customers, unless the agency has a valid reason for such a request or order, and such reason is not based solely on reputation risk. This sounds like it solves the exact problem we were talking about in Part 2, and it does. This certainly would stop porn stars or gun manufacturers from being discriminated against for solely reputational risk. So why is this series still going? Why didn't I just make the one video and leave it alone? The end of this bill defines who it applies to, and it only applies to banks and credit unions. While this appears to be a good faith attempt to resolve the issue, I would like to bring us back to the methods of Operation Choke Point from Part 2. We are targeting banks more than payment processors, and payment processors more than merchants. A year and 2 months later, we still have articles being written that include documented discrimination against payday lenders, gambling facilities, online pharmacies, gun stores, and others. This time, its names we're more familiar with here on YouTube. PayPal, Stripe, and Square seem to be continuing to inhibit high-risk activities. Just as in the heyday of Operation Choke Point, we still have the press advocating for these methods and doing it under the political guises that the original operation fell victim to. If we look back to the court documentation, we find emails released from the people running Operation Choke Point in which they discuss how they had attempted to persuade banks to take responsibility for the decisions themselves. This likely explains why the porn stars, specifically, had complaints about no reasons being given to them for the account terminations. All of this sounds far too familiar in recent years. This seems like a good time to introduce a Twitter thread by Nick Monroe that got me started on this topic. Thanks to Nick for starting me on this journey. At the beginning of this thread, Nick talks about how the deplatforming we are currently seeing on Patreon, specifically, may very well be the outputs of Operation Choke Point. At this point, I'll have to mildly disagree with Nick for the reasons stated before, but it seems he was pretty close. Let's go back to that list of risky behaviors. Hidden down near the bottom was, quote, racist material, end quote. We should take a look at the Sargon of Akkad video dealing with Patreon again.
To begin the appeal process, please respond with any evidence you feel helps explain why the language you used in conversation with Michelle Caitlin doesn't constitute hate speech.
In a memo to the Congressional Committee investigating Operation Choke Point, Assistant Attorney General Stuart Dellery said that Operation Choke Point acknowledged, quote, the possibility that banks may stop doing business with legitimate lenders, end quote, but concluded, quote, that solving that problem, if it existed, should be left to the legitimate lenders themselves, who can present sufficient information to the banks to convince them that they are wholly legitimate. End quote. It appears that the methods, at least, of Operation Choke Point are still in effect. To make matters worse, this seems to clearly demonstrate that the objectives are still in effect as well, and that they have pushed the racist material line harder than they were in 2014. A savvy viewer may note at this point that Patreon is not governed by the FDIC, and so it would appear I'm making too much of a leap while connecting these issues. To that viewer, I would direct you no farther than the deplatforming of Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch from Patreon at the request of MasterCard. The story has all the hallmarks of Operation Choke Point. Spencer was producing, quote, illegal content, end quote. What was that content? No one can say. What should he do about it? Appeal to MasterCard with evidence that he had not produced the vaguely described illegal content. No one was really responsible, and there was a massive bureaucratic edifice that was vaguely referencing a global payment network. Equally, of course, there was no notice or attempt to rectify the issue. There was simple account termination, just as our porn stars and gun brokers of the past had dealt with. One might note that Islamophobia is clearly and obviously racism in our current dialogue. It would seem that the biggest problem of the deplatforming of Robert Spencer was that MasterCard was brought up in the discussion. One simply cannot have such a clear line to the people that applied the requirement. How do we know this? Take a look at Matt Christensen's transcript of the call he had with Patreon. Per Jacqueline Hart of Patreon, quote, "Payment processing depends on our ability to use the global payment network, and they have rules for what they will process." End quote. Matt rightly presses her on the subject, and she quickly turns saying it's Patreon's mission. Based on the history of Operation Choke Point, it seems pretty clear that no one wants to be holding the bag when these bannings happen. Unfortunately for those in contact with the public, there's no one left to pass the buck to. They have to try and rationalize this to the public themselves. That may seem a somewhat tenuous connection, but it's worth noting that no one was ever held accountable for Operation Choke Point. It was simply ended and a law was passed to stop it from continuing with banks. Combing through the emails previously discussed, it appears that the top people responsible for executing Operation Choke Point were Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Mark Pierce, and Director Thomas Dujensky. While Director Dujensky retired, Director Pierce remains in his position at the FDIC to this day. Thanks for watching. Up next, Operation Choke Point and social media.